Hello, my name is Emilio James Del Cruz, and this is my presentation on James Watt. So, who was James Watt? James Watt, whose portrait's on the right of the screen, was an inventor, mechanical engineer, and chemist. He invented and discovered many different important ideas and machines, but is most known for the improvements he made on the already existing steam engine. Said improvements allowed the steam engine to be the base for the majority of great technological advancements within the Industrial Revolution. He was also the key developer of the idea of horsepower, which he used in regards to the power output of the steam engines compared to horses. And post-mortem, his name was used for the metric unit of power, which is the watt. His early life. James Watt was born to James Watt Sr. and Agnes Muirhead on January 19th, 1736, and he was the eldest of five surviving siblings. James Watt's father was a respected carpenter, and his grandfather was Thomas Watt, a teacher of mathematics, surveying, and navigation. And as a child, he had poor health and had to be homeschooled for the early years of his life. This poor health continued past his childhood, where it is said he has suffered from frequent headaches throughout the entirety of his life. Since he was homeschooled, he had access to his father's workshops, where he would work in and develop skills which would aid him in his career in mechanical engineering later on in his life. This is also when he began experimenting, especially with steam. Once he grew older, he became well enough to attend the Greenock Grammar School. This is where he discovered his affinity for mathematics, but his lack of interest in Greek and Latin. And on screen is an illustration depicting a young James Watt with his family at the dinner table. He is shown to be conducting experiments with the family tea kettle, presumably analyzing the workings of the steam produced by said kettle. It's worth noting that the tea kettle story is usually regarded as a myth, but still has some basis of fact, as Watt had used kettles as a boiler in some experiments to generate steam. Teenage years through early adulthood. When Watt turned 17, he had already decided to become a mathematical instrument maker. He then traveled to Glasgow to receive teaching from one of his mother's relatives for a year at the University of Glasgow for said job. He then traveled to London in 1755 for an apprenticeship. However, this apprenticeship only lasted approximately a year due to his recurring health problems, which interrupted it. However, he did feel that the teaching he received was enough for him to get by, stating that he had learned enough to work as well as most journeymen. He then returned to Glasgow in 1757 and opened a shop on the university campus, selling and repairing mathematical instruments. This shop was sanctioned by two of the professors there at the university, Joseph Black and Adam Smith, whom he would soon later befriend. Joseph Black was a physicist and a chemist, while Adam Smith was a famed economist and philosopher. The location also allowed Watt to aid in demonstrations at the school and produce quadrants. The quadrants were an instrument which measured angles up to 90 degrees, but could also calculate different readings such as longitude/latitude and the time. In 1759, a scholar friend of Watt's named John Robison alerted Watt to the idea of using steam as a source of power. This drew him to start experimenting with steam. He even attempted to create a steam engine model without even seeing an operating steam engine. These experiments led him to come to a conclusion that his friend Joseph Black had already made, that latent heat was a core part of understanding the steam engine. Another friend of his, John Anderson, asked Watt to repair a model of the already existing steam engine, the one created by Thomas Newcomen. He was able to fix it, but soon came to the realization that the engine was wasting around 3/4 of the generated thermal energy because the engine chamber was being cooled to reduce pressure, thus limiting the amount of thermal energy transferred into mechanical energy. And in May 1765, he came up with the idea of condensing the steam in a separated chamber, thus significantly lowering the amount of energy absorbed. And this is an artist's recreation of Watt inventing that separated condenser. The production of the steam engine. Watt's breakthrough regarding the separate condenser was in 1765. However, due to constant experimentation, he was nearly out of funds and was almost in poverty. This forced him to take a job as a civil engineer for 8 years, as well as having to borrow money from some of his friends. This job as a civil engineer limited the amount of time he could spend on further advancing this idea of the steam engine, and thus slowed it down. However, he was able to obtain a partnership with Cairn Iron Works founder John Roebuck, which allowed him to obtain a patent for the condenser in 1769, which he named a new invented method of lessening the consumption of steam and fuel in fire engines. However, Roebuck eventually went bankrupt in late 1769 and sold the half of his side of the patent rights to Matthew Boulton, who owned a factory in Birmingham. This factory allowed Watt access to premier materials, which streamlined the development process of the steam engine. It's worth noting that this partnership created between Boulton and Watt would become long-standing and would last for the next 25 years due to the success of the engine. And shown here is a diagram of the steam engine, where there are two water sources, one hot from the boiler and one cold from another area. The boiler would press out down into the pump, and which would go into the condenser, and then the other water source would fill a sink which was around that condenser, cooling down the water inside and pushing it back out into the boiler where it is reheat and it can loop in. This pressure created by the piston here would push up into the valve and then start pumping the air pumps, which would then start spinning the sun wheel turning mechanism and power the machines. These are some of the other advancements we made in the scientific community. The definition of the idea of horsepower, which was used as a comparison to the output of steam engines. Also, an employee of Boulton and Watt invented the sun and planet gear system. This was patented by Watt and employed into the ever-evolving steam engines application. And here's an example of the sun-planet gear system. One gear revolves around another, similar to how a planet revolves around the sun. There were also the many improvements to the steam engine. For example, there were the double-acting engines, which alternated the movement of steam onto both sides of the piston, the compound engine, which basically connected two engines together, greatly increasing the work given, and the steam indicator, which displayed the pressure amount within the cylinder. He also created an idea for a portable copying machine, which was used greatly in the 1800s. Later years and retirement. In 1764, James Watt married Margaret Miller, who was his cousin, and he had 5 children with her. Only 2 of the children had survived, James Jr. and Margaret. However, Margaret Miller passed away in 1772 during the childbirth of another child. Watt later remarried in 1777 to Anne MacGregor and had 2 more children with her. Anne MacGregor was the daughter of a dye maker within Glasgow. The 2 children were named Gregory and Janet, and Gregory went on to become a geologist and mineralogist. Watt ended up retiring in 1800, which was the same year his patent, as well as his partnership with Boulton, had expired. The partnership/firm was inherited by their sons James Watt Jr. and Matthew Robert Boulton, who also ended up owning the patent as well. Watt ended up continuing to invent into his retirement, however he never patented any of his ideas. Some of these inventions included machines that would copy soldiers and medallions. He also remained a consultant within the field of civil engineering to aid other projects. James Watt eventually died on August 25, 1819 in his home in Staffordshire. His lasting impacts. Watt's contribution to the improvement of steam engines completely changed the industry. His inventions were a key player in the Industrial Revolution, paving the way for crucial inventions such as the automobile, train, and steamboat. The steam engine also streamlined the factory process and allowed for a faster production of goods. and overall, he was a key person in the development of our current society. These are the sources.